and I will share my screen. Could you all hear when I was screen sharing everything okay?
I could hear it.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure it was working. All right, then we can get going for today. Let me just pull up everything real quick. Give me just a moment. And maybe today we can do this with using the hand raising function when you want to kind of answer and everything, just to make it a bit easier for us all. Okay. Sorry, just give me a second, everyone. Do any of you have your cameras turned on right now? Sorry, I don't see you.
Thank you, miss. I needed one. He went to go. I didn't know. He literally just came here.
Okay, give me just a second, everyone, and then we can kind of get going. There we go. For some reason, my video panel thing was turned off. Okay, now I can see you all, and we can kind of get going then. Okay, so today we are going to discuss lying with maps, kind of continuing on from last week. I hope you all enjoyed the little break that you got. And today we'll be talking about big lies, whereas last time we were talking about kind of those small lies that are often either unintentional or necessary or anything like that. So on the agenda, we are first going to just do a quick recap, like usual, of the small lies kind of part of this from last week and kind of remind you. And then we'll broadly talk about what we mean by big lies with maps. And then throughout the course, we'll kind of be getting into how to spot when map makers are lying intentionally and how to work through a lot of that. Then we'll talk about 3 kind of examples of big lies with maps. So we'll get into redistricting and gerrymandering. Both of those are not lies, but one of them definitely is. Then we'll talk about propaganda maps, and then we will talk about advertising maps. And then we'll kind of finish off. But with that, is there any logistical questions or anything that any of you have right now for me or Joseph about grades or anything else that's kind of coming up, or final projects maybe? And I did get your final project proposals graded, so if you haven't had a chance yet, please take a look at the comments and feedback I left you. And if I left you feedback saying like, please revise and resubmit this based upon my feedback, that means that I probably saw something in there where I thought this project wouldn't be feasible, or something along those lines. So with that, does anyone have any logistical questions or anything they want to go over before we kind of continue on with the lecture? Okay, it doesn't look like anyone does, but also if you just want to participate, please, if you could just hit oh, you do?
Yeah, but like I'm not paying attention to it. I'm looking at apartments.
All right. Anyway, so we'll kind of continue then. So in unintentional lies, or the small lies, so what does it mean, going back to this, what does it mean when we say that all maps lie? What did I mean when I was kind of bringing that up, or what did Mark Monmonier mean in the readings that you did? What does it mean to say that all maps lie, or every map lies? Yeah, Connor and then Madison.
All maps, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. All maps lie because they kind of have to leave out and like add certain things to just prove the point that they're trying to prove.
Yeah, so all maps lie partially because they have to leave certain things out and to kind of show whatever point they're making. Madison, what would you add to that?
Simply just like no map can ever be like 100% accurate or 100% perfect. So no matter what, it's gonna lie, even if it's just like really little.
Yeah, exactly. So no map is ever going to be perfect. And that kind of answers the second question as well, as to why do we call these small lies and not big lies, right? It's because these are the types of lies that allow us to even make maps in the first place. Or they're lies that are unintentional, those types of things as well. What does we kind of talked about this a bit last week, but what does this picture on here mean? And why do I use this in reference to mapping and to maps? Kind of going off of what Maddie was saying. What does this mean? This is not a pipe. If it's not a pipe, what is it? Madison?
It's because it's like a picture. It's a
Mhm.
picture of a pipe, or it's like a projection of a picture of a pipe. So it's like not actually a pipe.
Yeah, it's not actually a pipe. And so it's a picture of a pipe. What, more broadly, what is this? And
It's
why
a
does this relate to maps? Sorry, Madison. Madison, this could be you, this could be someone else. Whatever you want to do.
Isn't it because like maps like aren't actually like the terrain, or like maps aren't actually like what it's showing, it's just like a representation.
Yeah, it's a representation, exactly. Andrew, what do you want to add to that?
I was just gonna say that like it's like just like like you said, like it's a picture of it. So like
Mhm.
it doesn't really tell you like everything that's going on inside of it. So like I thought of it kind of like just like she said earlier, like the projection, like that may not actually be like what that pipe looks like.
Yeah, that could be part of it as well, for sure. Actually, I wasn't even thinking about that aspect. But generally, yeah, this is a representation of one, right? And we can think about this in terms of maps, because maps are not the territory; they're representations of the territory, which is often kind of confused, or there's kind of this assumption, right, that maps are the reality, where it's really not quite that clean. Not to say they don't have, a basis in reality and everything, but there's kind of these distinctions. So moving on. So there are 6 ways that maps lie, that all maps lie, and these are all kind of the small lies. So we've got the one, which is representation. What are the other, and we've actually mentioned a second one, which is projections. So what are the other ways that maps lie besides representation and projections? What are some of the 6 ways? Yeah, Julianne.
Like with symbolization and the different symbols they use.
Yeah, with symbolization, that's one. I just spoiled one. So another one is how you standardize the data. So we've got representation, we've got standardization, we've got symbolization, and we've got projection. So what are the other 2 ways that all maps lie? Yeah, Riley.
Classification.
Yeah, classification. Okay, what's that final one? Anybody remember that final way? It's very related to classification.
Is it symbolism?
We already got symbolization. You're getting closer though. Do you all remember when at last class what we were looking at when we were looking at the modifiable aerial unit problem? Do you remember this MOP? What was that? What was MOP a form of? Like, what was the problem with it? If none of you remember, it's okay though. But I'll give you a sec. It's a type of generalization. So you all, it's very related. I can see why it wouldn't come to mind directly. So these are kind of the 6 ways that maps lie. And then we've got all those distortions, which I don't think I need to really go over again, because I think you all kind of have a good grasp on it, but it's area, direction, distance, and shape. So those are kind of the four, right? Those ads. So before we kind of move on, just like real quick, what are the small lies that are being told in this map that we're looking at right now? This map of California. What are just like a few of the small lies that you can see when you're looking at it? And you can just call us out. You don't need to like raise your hand or anything if you have an idea or an answer.
The way that it's dividing up or classifying certain areas of California.
Yeah, so the way that it's kind of dividing up and classifying certain areas of California, and get going off of that, Matthew, right? I mean, if you look right here on these big counties on the side of California, there's not people living in all these places, right? There's a lot of area, a lot of land in there where no one is actually living. So that's one for sure. What other ways do you all see kind of this map lying, or what the issues are with this map? Maybe just like if you see like one or two other small lies that this map is telling, that's probably fine.
I don't know if you would still classify it as a lie, but there is no legend to describe like what the colors mean. So it seems like it's not really doing anything.
So this one's kind of a weird one because the text is a legend, but the text is kind of a legend with each colored area, because they're just indicating that there's a quarter of the population there. But I think that would be a lie if there wasn't a legend, right? Or if that wasn't there for sure. I mean, I'm even thinking something pretty broad, like California is not connected. This is just California alone, and it's not connected to anything else, right? It's kind of being disconnected from everything around it, making it look like it exists in isolation. So, but that's just a small lie, right? That doesn't necessarily influence the data or how we think of it or anything. But with that, we can kind of keep going to intentional lies unless anyone has any other questions or anything about that. Okay, so intentional lies. This is my specialty as a scholar in some ways. So this is essentially like when you exploit the limitations of mapping to deceive people intentionally. So a lot of times, there are these unintentional lies like we kind of went over, right? But a lot of times those maps are intentionally used to lie and deceive through the exploitation of the inherent kind of limitations that come from map making, and so this is often kind of, to say the least, it's discouraged by map makers, because if you kind of make your career on making accurate maps and everything, and then there's these types of maps, it kind of throws into question the legitimacy or the validity of your own work as a map maker. And so a lot of times we have to be really, really careful to find whether maps are lying and to figure them out, right? And so there's like a few questions that we can ask when we look at a map. Okay, and so we say, who benefits? And these are, I think, are really good questions to always keep in mind, especially with political maps, which is who benefits from the map? So who is benefiting in some way from this map existing, and what context is missing in the map? Okay, and so how is this map lying? Like if we think about this, right? Okay, so here's some context for this. This is a map that was published in 1940. It was published by Facts and Review, which was essentially a mouthpiece for Nazi Germany. That kind of at that time existed like in Western Europe more generally, but it often published in English. Okay, and so let me ask you this now. With those two questions in mind, who benefits and what context is missing, how is this map lying? What are kind of some of the lies that you see in this map right here?
It's not proportional. Certain things, like Australia, looks bigger than like much larger continents or countries.
Okay, so the shape is being kind of distorted for sure, especially like the shape of like Australia versus South Asia, for example. So how else is this map lying? Who benefits from this map? Yeah, Connor.
Germany definitely benefits from this, and they're also lying because like it says it was published in 1940, so it's also leaving out the areas that they would have already occupied by then.
So it would be leaving out the areas of Europe that Germany had already occupied, even leaving out Germany's own history of empire, right? In the past, Germany might not have been as big of a player in colonialism, but they definitely were part of it. And there's also this, see, this is kind of the thing, and this is why these types of maps are tricky, is because there is truth to this map, right? The British Empire was huge, especially in 1940, you know, and so this map is not wrong, but that's kind of at the heart of why maps are kind of useful for lying, because what they can do is they can have like this center of truth, which is Britain has a large empire, and then they can kind of distort that in a variety of ways for their own gain. And then what this is doing in the context of the Second World War, prior to the Second World War, right, is it's trying to say, you know, Germany is not the aggressor nation in this way. Germany is not doing anything. Germany is just defending itself against the British Empire that controlled 26% of the world at that time, which is accurate. So that's kind of an example of this. So now for the kind of the rest of class, we're going to talk about gerrymandering, and we'll talk about propaganda maps, and then we'll talk about maps that are used for advertising. But real quick, because a few people have asked about this actually leading up to this, I want to talk about contested borders and the ways that mapping actually today is even kind of interesting, the ways that people lie in a lot of ways, you know? And so if we can see, we look at these three maps, which are showing Kashmir. Do any of you kind of know what's going on in Kashmir and what's been happening there for kind of a long time now, for like the past 20 years, essentially? Do any of you have context for what's happening in Kashmir or know about it?
Yeah, do you want me to just kind of explain it?
Sure.
Okay, so like Kashmir is a province in North India. Well, that's depending on how you take it. It's north of India, and India claims all of it. Pakistan claims like 2/3 of it, and then China claims another third of it. And there's just a lot of contested borders, and it's even illegal in India to display a map without Kashmir as part of India in it.
Yeah. And then so you're correct, right? There's those three, right? It's India. So Kashmir is this area kind of in the northern part of South Asia. And then on the one hand, India says Kashmir is part of India, and Pakistan says, no, it's part of Pakistan. China also says that certain portions of it are part of China. And then there's this added thing, right? Which is a lot of people in Kashmir are actually like Kashmiri nationalists who are saying like, no, we're our own sovereign state. And so what we can see with this type of contested border is that maps are really, really kind of useful, right, for displaying what your preference is. And you can see it in the ways that media sources actually will map out the same area differently depending on their inclinations. So Fox News, for example, shows that Kashmir is part of Pakistan. I'm sorry, is part of Pakistan. CNN shows that it's part of India, and the BBC shows that it's actually contested, right? And that it's not totally sure which is which and these types of things. And so this is actually this is a very, very deep tension when it comes to things like Google Maps, because actually like people get mad at Google. And so Google will actually display what this area looks like and who controls it differently depending on where you are. And so going off of what Matthew was saying in India, if you're on Google Maps showing this, it'll show it as part of India for a variety of reasons. Whereas maybe if you're elsewhere, it'll show it's contested and these types of things. And even a little closer to the U.S., this kind of happened, has been an ongoing conflict between the countries of Venezuela and Guyana, where Guyana, basically Venezuela has laid claim to about half of Guyana, like all this area west of this one river. And what they're doing and what they're doing is they're kind of using maps to do so. And so if we look at it on Google Maps, let me pull up Google Maps real quick. So if we actually look up this area on Google Maps, it will either show, I think should show that it's just like contested. Let's see. But then there's kind of issues with that where Venezuela and others have been kind of putting on, let's see. Oh yeah, actually, if you look at this, so Google Maps right now is actually not showing it as contested, whereas in Venezuela, they're kind of pressuring Google to do so. So these are just some ways that maps can kind of be used to intentionally lie, right? For governments or nations to kind of expand their borders and everything. So now we get to redistricting and gerrymandering. So I think you already kind of have an idea of what gerrymandering is, or I don't know how many of you do, but do any of you know what redistricting is or how redistricting works? Maybe that you could briefly kind of explain. It came up in the reading though, in the Colbert reading. So actually, if you can go off of that as well. So redistricting and gerrymandering are often kind of conflated with each other, but they're these different things. So redistricting is the process of redrawing political boundaries based on changes in population in the US. Andrew, is there something you want to add to that?
I was just gonna answer the question, and that like generally what happens is like as populations in certain areas grow, and usually it's based off of a census done every 10 years. They like determine like what areas determine, like especially at the national level, what areas are roughly the same population, and then they have to like take those so that they can like determine like how many delegates.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely a big part of it. Michael, were you going to add something to that? Okay. So yeah, that's definitely a big part of it, Andrew. Thank you. So this is a way of redrawing political boundaries based on changes in population. So what it's doing primarily is it at least at the national level that we often think of, is it's used to decide how the 435 seats in the House of Representatives are kind of sorted out or like kind of portioned out to each other. And so that's dependent on shifts in population, right? And so, for example, because there's only 435 seats and that's not changing anytime soon, partially because of how large the building is. I found out pretty recently they don't want to expand the building. That what that means is that if a state gains population, then proportionally another state is losing population, right? And so then the amount of representatives in one state might fluctuate from, say, if they have 8 representatives, then to 10 representatives. This happens kind of often. This is mandated by the US Constitution, although it's really, really vague in the Constitution about how it works. And it happens at all levels of governance. So actually what I'm showing you right now is this happens in Bloomington. There's redistricting in Bloomington itself for city council seats and everything, right? And the person who is the city councilor for, I believe, this area, although I can't remember, was actually somebody who's on the city council who was in the geography department working on his master's degree while he was doing a lot of that. Like Andrew kind of mentioned, the redistricting occurs every 10 years following the census. It is not the same as gerrymandering, and I want to really hammer that home. If you remember nothing else about redistricting and gerrymandering, remember that they are not the same things. So gerrymanders are a type of redistricting, but not all redistricting is gerrymandering. And there's a lot of redistricting that's totally legitimate and valid, and there's kind of a lot to it, in terms of having to have equal population, equal voting power, these types of things. But now we can kind of talk a little bit about what gerrymandering is. And so I think this video from Vox kind of gets into it really nicely. So I will mute myself and we'll play this real quick.
There are some things in life that Canada is just better at. Poutine, for instance, being polite, appreciating Robin Sparkles, and these days, elections. America does something very weird in its elections. The way elections are supposed to work is voters choose their politicians. But in America, politicians often get to choose their voters. The word gerrymandering comes from Elbridge Gerry. He was governor of Massachusetts from 1810 to 1812. After he took office, his party redrew the map of the state's Senate districts in a shockingly partisan manner. The aim was to help his party win as many elections as possible by creating as many districts as it could, or at least 51% of the voters would favor Gerry's allies. And that's basically what gerrymandering is. We've got 435 congressional districts in this country. Somebody needs to divide them up. And amazingly, most states let politicians divide them up. The results are totally predictable. You can see how this works in North Carolina. Democrats won 50.5% of the House vote in 2012, but Republicans won 9 House seats to the Democrats' 4. If you want to see why, just look at the map. Look at district number 4. It kind of looks like two legs running away from this whole mess. Look at district 9, which is getting punched in the neck by district 5 and kicked in the gut by district 12. And damn, look at district 12. It's like a little worm wriggling away from North Carolina. These districts may look weird, but they're what political scientists call efficient. They cluster the state's Democratic voters into a few districts where they have huge majorities, and they spread the state's Republican voters into more districts where they have slimmer majorities. So in District 12, the Democrat won by almost 60%. No Republican won a district by more than 30%. That meant they could win more districts and more House seats in total. And that's what happens when you let politicians choose their voters. This is how Canada did it too, but then in the 1960s, they took the power away from partisan politicians and gave it to independent commissions. America could do this too if it wanted, and then we could stop feeling bad about how much better Canada is at elections, and instead feel good that we get to wear such a nice, polite country as a hat.
So yeah, that's kind of gerrymandering. Vox often is able to explain things in a much more interesting way than I maybe would be able to. So gerrymandering, there we go. I don't know why these are already showing up, but oh well. So redistricting, right? Different things, but gerrymandering itself has its origins in the U.S. Constitution, and in the Constitution, it's specified, right, with the census that every 10 years they had to redraw these districts. But kind of like he was getting into with Elbridge Gerry, which is why it's called a gerrymander, is gerrymandering this has been kind of a way from the beginning to weaken the opposing party. And I don't know if you all remember in the reading that you did with Elizabeth Colbert, she kind of even gets into how the first gerrymander actually happened even before it had been named a gerrymander, right? By James Madison, who kind of gerrymandered an area to kind of go against some of his anti-federalist kind of opponents, political opponents, and so we could see James Madison as the kind of the founder of gerrymandering. From the 19th to the 20th century, gerrymandering changed over time. It definitely existed, but it was kind of different because there were a lot of these Supreme Court rulings that actually changed how the census had to work and how populations had to be distributed. And so the Constitution actually only doesn't really say anything about there having to be equal population in districts or anything like that. That was a Supreme Court ruling. And so kind of starting in roughly the 20th century, there started to be these challenges to gerrymandering that were a lot more explicit. And they were often legal, and they were kind of looking at the unfairness of gerrymandering. And so that's where population equality requirements come in. That's where shape requirements come in, where a district has to be as compact as possible, although there's debate about what compactness even means and these types of things. But really, gerrymandering has come into kind of its own in the 21st century. And so close to the end of the 20th century, computers began to be really, really involved in redistricting, and they were able to kind of help make these more precise decisions a lot more quickly and analyze the data in a way that could help draw districts in a way that works, right, and that was fair. And so today, pretty much all redistricting is done using GIS, and actually using some of the tools that we've even used in this class is how redistricting and gerrymandering are done. And actually this past summer, I worked on a project, or I guess this would be last summer, I worked on a project with the state of Indiana, kind of doing some GIS work for them and helping them develop a lot of this software. But essentially what gerrymanders are doing is they're circumventing these requirements of population equality, voting equality, and so on. And so gerrymandering today is now more common than ever. It's really, really, really common. And with the exception of some states like Iowa and Arizona, which have those independent redistricting commissions that they talked about, it happens in pretty much every state. So it's particularly common though in Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Texas. And oftentimes where gerrymandering happens the most heavily are swing states. So when there's not a swing state, right, is when there's not a majority of either party. And so it could kind of swing either way. And so that's where gerrymandering really, really kind of comes into its own. And I think I forgot to mention this, but actually the people who draw the redistricting lines are people that are in the state legislature. So people who are representatives for the Indiana State House of Representatives or those kinds of things. So it's not even congressmen at the national level. But gerrymandering today is also different because historically it was more of an art and it wasn't really based on data. It was more kind of based on the person drawing the map, thinking about what they could gain. Whereas today it's really become more of a science. And so with GIS and computing, but also just with all of this data that's available to collect outside of the census. And this is what happens. And I was using data like this for a project as well, pretty similar to this, where you can get data on voting preferences, gender, education levels, ethnicity, consumption habits, income levels, and a lot of other types of data. And this is actually what a lot of these gerrymanders are based upon. Using those characteristics as kind of proxies, they're able to figure out who will vote in what way, and then basically kind of exploit those population patterns. So we could really think about redistricting maps as being weaponized for partisan gain, partially because of computers, but partially because it's a weapon that's meant to kind of benefit one group over another with the use of maps. So then we've got this thing called Project Red Map. Do any of you, based on the readings, remember what Project Red Map was, or how did Elizabeth Colbert describe Project Red Map in the reading?
I think from what I remember, it was like a Republican group or committee of some sort, like sought to try to like get some of these states that maybe were like swing states or like occasionally went blue in order to like redistrict them for a much better like chance of Republican victory. And like I think it was like the 2010 census or something.
Yeah, so that was basically it. So Project Red Map was this project that was created by a Republican donor organization, which I can't remember the name of right now, but I'll think of it. That was headed by this guy named Thomas Hofeller. And what Project Red Map was trying to do using the 2010 redistricting, so this actually happened started before 2010, was they wanted to turn states that voted Democratic into states that voted Republican through the use of gerrymandering that was based upon computation. And so what Project Red Map was doing, I actually went to that next one. What Project Red Map was really doing was funding numerous local candidates across the US for state Senate and state House in Democratic states. And so the reason why is because those maps are being drawn at the state level. And so then instead of giving money to a bunch of, say, House of Representatives people or senators who are nationally senators, what they could do is they could give a ton of money to these smaller races. And that money goes a lot farther in those races. And so then what happened was they were able to take out over a bunch of state houses throughout the US, in particular, kind of these states around here. And then they could redraw those political districts in a way that would benefit the Republican Party but disadvantage the Democratic Party. And so a lot of the areas that were focused are kind of highlighted here in red, right? And so Indiana was one of the ones that was focused on for some reason. even though it's kind of more of a conservative state, but like Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, or Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, right? These kind of swing states and everything. And Project Red Map has been a really, really, really big success. It's like to the point that there's these massive gerrymanders that have been coming out in the past few years, right? Where a lot of people have either been disenfranchised or they have a lot less voting power. There's all these issues that come along with it. But I do want to be clear with gerrymandering before you're going to have a little group activity. But I do want to be clear about gerrymandering, which is Republicans are not the only ones that gerrymander. Democrats gerrymander as well. And the thing is that the reason that Republicans have been so dominant in gerrymandering recently is not because Democrats wouldn't do that. It's because Democrats have not been as good at that, at doing it. They don't have their own version of Project Red Map. And when all this stuff came out about Project Red Map and its existence and Thomas Hofeller, the Democratic Party announced their own version of it. But they haven't, as far as I know, they haven't really been able to raise as much money and these other types of things. And one thing with Project Red Map as well is that Project Red Map was secret until about the past couple of years. And right after Thomas Hofeller died, he had, I guess, alienated his daughter so much that she actually released all of these files publicly that he had that people didn't even know existed. Where it's like they didn't even know he was working in a lot of these states, let alone gerrymandering them. Yeah, Andrew.
I also just wanted to say too, like a lot of the reason that like I think we hear about like Republicans gerrymandering more is because in 2010 they had control of like the House and possibly the Senate at the time. So like when these census came out and like in 2010 when they would do these redistricting, like you hear about it more because like the Republicans were in power at the time. And like it's something that like I know I've seen like in recent trends, like whoever's in power, like when the census comes out, tends to like do more gerrymandering because they have more control in those areas.
Yeah, no, that's a good point to bring up for sure, Andrew. Thank you. Yeah, part of it is just like that Republicans were kind of in control at that time. And so then it came up as well. But I just want to say, so basically my point with this is that gerrymandering is a bipartisan thing. It's for partisan gain, but the act of doing it is not limited to one party. So now I'm going to break you all up into groups and I'll kind of randomize that in just a second. But what I want you to do is go to these gerrymandering maps from 538 and then go to Indiana and see what it looks like. And then based upon the factors that are on the 538, which I'll pull up real quick, if it will open. But based upon these different factors on the 538 Atlas of redistricting, so kind of mess with these at the level of Indiana. So I'll do it at Colorado, just so we can kind of look. And then kind of do this with Indiana and just see how it changes and kind of discuss it with your group a bit. So kind of talk about these questions, like what do you find surprising? What do you know now about gerrymandering that maybe you didn't before? And what patterns are you seeing in Indiana? Andrew, do you still have your hand raised or is that from before?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, I just wanted to be sure. Okay, so I'm now going to stop sharing and I'm going to break you into groups. So what do you all think of this? Like, what did you kind of come up with in your groups as to like what did you see that was kind of surprising about these maps? Here, I'm gonna continue sharing my screen. Yeah, what did you find surprising about these maps? Yeah, Andrew.
One thing that really surprised me was that like in the state of Indiana specifically, that you could gerrymander the entire state to vote Republican. But like even just by favoring it for like Democrats, you really only like have the same number of like guaranteed districts and then like one competitive district. So I found that pretty interesting.
Did any of you notice the change that happened in Indianapolis or around the area around Indianapolis between the two? Maybe someone who hasn't talked. Well, Connor, actually go ahead. But maybe if someone can add as well. Connor, what did you see?
We just kind of saw that in Indianapolis, they had like kind of cut off like the top part of Marion County was part of District 5, and that was a light red. And in the new map, they made the bottom half not part of that district and the top half part of it. Now it's full red.
Yeah, exactly. So that's like kind of interesting to think about this because people often think that gerrymandering only happens in places where like Ohio or Pennsylvania, right? But then when you're looking at this, what's actually happening is they anywhere can be gerrymandered to the point that like that part of Indiana is being gerrymandered because that's probably where the largest proportion of Democratic voters are in the state, you know. So trying to kind of crack those voters apart or split them up. What I guess like is there anything that you all kind of discussed in the group that like this map kind of showed or these maps kind of showed you about gerrymandering that maybe you hadn't really been aware of before? Anything else that anyone wants to share, or maybe anything that was surprising to you about these? So maybe someone who hasn't talked yet today, what was surprising about these to you? And you don't have to raise your hand if you just have something you want to say.
Like a lot of the districts like look really red, but like when you like if you hover over Illinois, like a lot of it looks really red, but like Democrats like are leading in that state. So like that like kind of surprised me. Like you would expect that like because like majority of the state is red that it would be like more Republican.
Yeah, totally right. And so it's kind of surprising to see the ways that there's this difference in what the reality of the situation is and how people vote versus this other stuff. But I just noticed what time it is, so we can kind of keep going. I could talk about I could teach like a whole class on gerrymandering. But unfortunately I can't. But I hope you all found that pretty useful. And also, before I forget to say, it is voting day. So if you haven't voted, and if you're able to vote and inclined to vote, I would definitely do that before you kind of are not able to. So definitely go in and do that. But yeah, now we can kind of get going to propaganda maps. So propaganda maps are a very, very they're kind of a popular subject when it comes to this, right? That book, Lying with Maps, that I've assigned some stuff to you from, has an entire chapter about this. But what is propaganda? Do any of you know what propaganda is, or have like a kind of a working definition of what propaganda is that you could give us? This didn't come up in the readings or anything, so I'm just asking you, just like, what do you think of when you think of propaganda? Yeah, Julianne.
So I'm an international studies major, and so when we talk about propaganda, we normally just talk about information that's spread usually by the government or a large organization that's intentionally not wrong, but usually misleading in some sort of way to push a particular narrative.
Yeah. So it's trying to push a particular narrative of sorts, right? And it can be, I think that's like a really good way of putting it, right? It can be governments, it can be corporations, it can be other organizations. Propaganda was particularly a big thing during the Cold War, where maps were often used to exert influence and win people over either to communism or capitalism. It does make me want to ask, though, is propaganda always bad? And is it always necessarily coming from, people at the top, right? Is it always coming from governments and corporations, or is there another form of propaganda that can be kind of a bottom up type thing, right? To kind of convince people. This is just like off my head, off the top of my head, and we'll kind of get into this, but maybe thinking in a more nuanced way about propaganda and what purpose it serves, rather than just thinking about it in terms of governments or corporations, which of course are big ones, but even thinking about how do individuals, organizations, or small groups engage in propaganda, maybe even on IU's campus. Yeah, thank you for posting that, Joe. Think about misinformation and everything. I mean, I kind of think, are things like flyers a form of and posters? Would those be a form of propaganda for organizations on campus? Trying, like, especially political organizations on campus, or maybe, for example, graduate students, if you all remember, went on strike for a bit and have been trying to unionize, right? It's maybe some of those tactics could be considered a form of propaganda. So just kind of considering I'm basically just trying to get you to think a little deeper about that aspect as well, for everyone. But maps are used for propaganda for the same reasons that art and literature are used for propaganda. They're convincing tools for influencing people and persuading people in one way. Because people trust maps implicitly, it makes them really useful vehicles for spreading propaganda through falsehood and misrepresentations, but even more generally. Also, I should say, I'm not necessarily promoting propaganda. I'm just saying, like, there's like I've recently started considering this in the past few months about whether we can think about propaganda in these different ways, or whether that's just a different thing. And so a lot of times maps are used for these propaganda maps are used to foster nationalism, foster these feelings of patriotism, or maybe even these feelings of security. And often they're used to control and exclude people. So we can think about maps. We'll kind of go through a few of those. So we've got nationalist propaganda maps, which means maps that are used to increase nationalist fervor in some way by emphasizing us versus them. So what maps are doing is they're actually used to create this sense of nationhood where people can relate to each other by the geographical boundaries of the country that they inhabit. There are certain arguments that people will even make that actually nations don't even exist until they're mapped, because you have to have some representation of the nation as a whole to get people to buy into it. So there's a lot of ways that this can be done. You can do direct size comparisons. And so if we can see this map, this is what I was thinking a little bit about with the propaganda thing as well, which is this is a map from Portugal saying Portugal is not a small country. And it's trying to emphasize that actually Portugal is a large and an important country, and that size is not necessarily what makes it important. But if you were to do size, then you would see that it's reasonably sized in comparison to, say, the United States. Of course, there's also the aspect in this map of colonialism with Angola and Mozambique and everything as well. Potentially what you can do is you can emphasize certain places while ignoring others. Oops, let me go back. So if we look at this bottom map, what we can see is that this is kind of being used to foster this sense of patriotism for people that live in those cities. I have questions about why this is a map even being made by homes.com, and where they got this data and how they kind of put this all together. But, okay. And so what this is doing is, right, it's kind of producing this sense of American exceptionalism. And maps are really effective for doing this, mostly because people view them as objective, right? And so then when you position maps as objective, it makes them really difficult to see how they have this potential for propaganda and everything. So, going back to these Cold War maps, right? I mean, Cold War maps are an amazing resource just for kind of looking at them, so we could see, and I'll go through both US produced or first world, quote unquote, first world produced maps as well, and third world ones. But, this map is showing that the Soviet Union is a threat globally, right? And then what it's doing is it's kind of saying, like, okay, communism is coming out of these borders and everything, right? So this is kind of a propaganda map showing that the threat of communism needs to be contained. Or we've got this other map. This is kind of like from a cartoon showing Joseph Stalin kind of crawling across Europe and picking out these areas that are influencing these other areas within the country, within Europe, kind of. I have questions about who determined this map, like who thinks that France is a communist country and not like one of the most like capitalist oriented countries of the past 200 years. But this is also kind of this propaganda map. we've got this one, you know, the Tsar's Will on 1944 Europe. So this is actually published even before the end of the Second World War, right? Kind of showing the beginnings of the Cold War. So this wasn't even, Cold War hadn't even technically begun yet when this map was being made, and yet the Soviet Union, who was allied with the US, was still kind of being viewed as a threat in a lot of these different ways. And then we've got this one, right, which is showing the influence of communism around the world, right? It's like, how are they influencing South America? How are they influencing Europe? How are they influencing everywhere else? And, you know, it's like interesting, right? They've got in South America, for example, they've got it saying that they're using subversion and infiltration of political movements and universities and trade unions, with the implication that the US doesn't also do those things in other countries as well, and infiltrate a lot of these social movements and everything, which famously the CIA has done a lot of times. So we can kind of think of this, right, as this nationalist propaganda, you know. And then we've got all these other ones, which I probably won't spend a super long time on, but we've got Cold War propaganda. So this one is showing how big the US is and how and everything. We've got this one, which is from I think it's a Chinese produced map of Vietnam during the Vietnam War and kind of the conflict there, showing all of the different routes that people could take that were kind of underground, but then kind of combined with all these pictures, right? So meant to foster this nationalism within Vietnam. We've also got this one of China, kind of showing all this stuff, and we've got Mao up here. This one of Cuba, kind of showing the routes that were taken when Cuba was, as it's being put in this map, being liberated by Castro and the Communist Party within Cuba. And so these are all kind of these examples of nationalist maps that are meant to foster some sort of nationalism, right? And then we've got war propaganda maps, which are pretty important, you know, but like essentially what they're doing is they're kind of trying to emphasize the strength and power of one's country against their enemies in times of war, which can then create these feelings of security and safety. So then you feel like you're stronger or whatever, or they can be used to demoralize kind of these opposing forces. So this map on the right is actually, I didn't know this the first few times I taught it, nobody caught this, but I actually thought originally this was an American map, and it turns out that actually this was a map from Nazi Germany, and what they were trying to say is basically like, okay, the Allies can come and take back over Europe, but like it's going to take a long time, and there's going to be a lot of different casualties. And they were anticipating that would last even longer, right? And so what this map was meant to do is demoralize American troops, basically during the Second World War, and say like, okay, you can do this, but a lot of you are going to die. World War II propaganda maps are like a gold mine. There's so many of them. That's why they're all over this. This is probably like the most propaganda maps created like of any time period that I can find, right? So we've got this one, and this is showing kind of the way that US forces were kind of honing in on the Japanese Empire over time and squeezing them, you know, kind of over time and everything. We've got this one where it's showing kind of the different targets of the Allies, particularly Tokyo and Berlin. This is actually a Japanese propaganda map showing the strength of the Japanese Empire. And so, you know, we've got FDR crying up here, and Winston Churchill just looking very, very concerned. We've got all these happy people down here. And so if you can see where my mouse is, there's a Japanese soldier giving candy to children, and the children are holding the flags. This map is amazing, and it has so many small details like that, you know. This is a one from Nazi Germany, showing the ways that Nazi Germany, so I don't know if any of you know this, it's like what's the word? Lebensraum, which was kind of this whole thing during the Second World War, where they were kind of like, they needed living space and to grow out. And so what this hand is doing right here, doing the kind of the Hitler salute, is it is actually going in the direction that they anticipated expanding out to, which was Slavic countries. Essentially, they viewed Slavic countries as open space that could just be dominated. And then this one is kind of doing a similar thing where it's kind of saying like, look, all these areas are actually German, but they're not controlled by Germany, trying to kind of emphasize and legitimize the conquest of those areas. Propaganda maps are also used domestically though. So it's not only in foreign policy and foreign policy context. They're often used to control and exclude people, especially people that are viewed as threats within the country. And so then what they're trying to do is they're actually trying to visualize those threats inside of a country, but what they're doing often is actually producing the threats. So oftentimes this has to do with minority communities in the US. And historically that maps have been really central to that exclusion and the marginalization of people. So for this is actually a really pretty eye-opening example. So this is a map that was created by the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. And what it's doing is it's actually showing areas that could make up a Black country in the US at the time. And what the map was doing was it was actually kind of being used to justify the idea that African Americans were inherently separate and unequal. And so what this is doing is it's essentially pushing for these areas to be made into their own countries, completely separate from the US. And completely segregated. And so what this is it's a vision of an extreme form of segregation where not only are public spaces being segregated, but also literally people are being put into their own, African-American people will be put in their own countries entirely. There's also a lot of stuff happening here, which is there's a lot of issues with a lot of organizers were kind of members of the Communist Party and stuff. A lot of these organizers in African American communities and in southern areas were members of the Communist Party or kind of these more left-wing activists as well. And so there's kind of that addition as well, right? Where they're being marked as threats. And then as threats, they're being kind of separated out using the maps. And then it can just be used generally to scapegoat people, right? And so this isn't necessarily scapegoating people, but like it is kind of a way of turning particular people into threats. And so we can see that even in relation to other groups of people. Like, I don't know if you all remember a few years ago, there was this this caravan is what they were calling it that was coming up from South America. And I mean, there were probably like hundreds of maps of that caravan kind of trying to paint them as threats to security, threats to safety, all these other types of things. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should definitely go look it up. Definitely kind of take a look at it and everything. Maybe I'll even put it in next time this class is taught. So given the time, I'm probably going to skip this exercise, but if you have time after class, definitely just go check out these different maps. This is from the Persuasive Map collection that's at Cornell. It's a really cool. Yeah, it's a really, thank you, Joseph, for adding that about CPUSA and everything. That map was also kind of the beginning of the end, or at the same time for the CPUSA in the US. That was kind of the beginning of their fall around that period. But yeah, please go check out these maps from the Persuasive Maps collection. They're really pretty interesting, and there's a ton of them. And then we get into advertising maps. So I'm not going to spend quite as much time on advertising maps, just given the time and everything, but we'll briefly talk about it. So a lot of times maps are used in advertisements to show the reach of a company's products. And so what that means is that they're trying to show that their product is everywhere and their product is popular, kind of as a way to like legitimize it. And then they can also kind of exaggerate the success of those products as a way to kind of increase demand for them. So, on the legitimizing side, right, we've talked about this a lot, and I just want to reemphasize it, right? Maps for corporations and for advertising are really good because they're being represented as objective. And that kind of facilitates those lies. And so it's like, because those maps are assumed to be authoritative and companies know that, they can kind of exploit that as a way to be like, look how great our stuff is, please buy it, kind of like legitimizing it in a lot of ways. So they can legitimize anything, basically. You know, it's like maps are being used as a way to increase demand for a particular product through authority. And so what maps will do, what companies will do with maps is they'll actually kind of over exaggerate the success of it, and kind of over exaggerate that popularity of that. So, you know, if we want to look at these maps right here, right, showing these are advertisements for Heathrow. Okay, I know that's technically not a corporation, but like it is making money and everything, and it does profit. What these are doing for Heathrow is they're showing both that Heathrow is the center of the world on the one on the left, right? Because you can go from London to anywhere in the world, and it makes Heathrow look like a lot better than it actually is. And then the same deal with kind of going back. So it's like not only can you go anywhere from London, you can also go from anywhere to London. And so then it's kind of centering Heathrow in a lot of different ways and making it look a lot larger and exaggerating its own reach globally in a lot of different ways. Does that kind of make sense to everyone as to why that would be useful for companies to use maps and everything? Okay. And then, you know, relatedly, right, just thinking about exaggerating one's own success, a map can make a company appear a lot more popular than they actually are. So we're taking this map on the right. This is a map of Verizon's coverage that covers nearly all of the US. Why is this map a lie? In what way is this map being used as as kind of a lie for advertising? Like, why would I put this on here? What's the deal with this? Why is it a lie? Yeah, Andrew.
I was gonna say, could it be that just like within those like dense red spots that like either the coverage like it may exist or but it's not very good, or like there are still small sections in those all red areas where people don't actually have cell service?
Yeah, so there might be an issue of scale here, right? Which is like, because it's at this large scale, there might be areas even within the red spots where people don't have coverage, like they say. But why else is this a lie? So what is this map showing? This map is supposedly showing cell coverage for Verizon, but what is this map showing? Just like you just guess if you have an idea. What do you think this map is showing? Yeah, Michael.
Is it just showing population density?
Yeah, this map is just showing population density. This map actually isn't even showing cell coverage at all. It's literally a population map. Thank you, Michael. Although Andrew, you were correct though, right? That even if it was an actual cell coverage map, that would also be a lie because of using scale and everything. But this is literally a population map. I mean, you can like tell, right? Like, I mean, look, all these areas are just areas where not as many people live. But what Verizon is doing is they're utilizing that population density to, you know, show how good they are, right? And make them seem a lot better. And it actually literally even says that it's population data as well, which I didn't notice. I actually didn't realize until now. And so a lot of times they're just missing these key elements, right? They're missing data. They're missing where the legend is. You know, it kind of makes them more difficult to read. And so basically what these are doing is they're emphasizing their success, but omitting their failure. And then we get to Paper Towns. Have any of you read that novel by John, what's his name? John Green, Paper Towns? Have any of you seen this, or is this before your time?
I've read it.
Okay, yeah. So do you
There was a
remember?
movie put out too.
Yeah, there's a movie. Do you guys remember what the main town is in that? It's okay. It's okay. I've got it right here. It's Algo, Algo or Aglo, New York, not Algo. So what a paper town is. So that book, the reason I bring that up is because that book is interesting in that it actually takes a paper town as its fictional location. I have not read that book in a long time. And I didn't really like it when I read it, but like it's a very relevant one in this way. So what a paper town is, or a phantom settlement is, and I think this is just an interesting way to kind of end class, there are these settlements that appear on maps, but they don't actually exist in real life. And so this has been intentional sometimes and sometimes unintentional. We've seen maps in this class that have paper towns on them that weren't intentionally done. So a lot of times what these map making companies would do historically, this doesn't really happen as much now, is they would actually insert fake places into their maps as a way to detect copyright infringement. And so basically what would happen would be like these atlas companies would be copying each other and doing so much copyright infringement, and then they wouldn't be able to prove it because it's a map showing everywhere. And so what they would do is they would put these fake towns so that way they could point to that town and be like, see that town right there? That's not even real. We know that you copied us. So basically just trying to determine if someone's stealing your work. And so there's a lot of examples of this in the US. We've got Agloe, New York, which is the setting of paper towns. That's why that's kind of interesting, because he took a place that's not even real and then made it a place in his book. Goblu, Ohio is another one. Argleton, England. London trap streets, which are kind of like these streets that don't actually exist in London, but they're on maps and stuff. So this is kind of just a part of how map making and everything has been used by advertising or by corporations and everything. Yeah, Andrew.
I was just curious, like, where does does like Google or anything like have some of these paper towns on them, and therefore or like the streets or whatever, and like now someone's like making a wrong turn or something because of GPS?
So that does happen sometimes, where like Google will put a town there or something that isn't really there, but it tends to be fixed pretty quickly. And it's not really the same anymore because they were doing it intentionally to kind of catch people who are copying them. But it does happen sometimes where Google maybe has bad data or whatever, and they'll put stuff there. Even last class, someone mentioned to me that when they were zooming into their hometown, they noticed that Google was giving it names that were not like nobody in the town actually uses. So we can kind of see that here as well. And with that, I will let you guys go. So I just want to remind you real quick before you do, this Thursday, the gerrymandering article review is due. And then next Tuesday, quiz 3 is due. So if you haven't gotten the readings done yet, or you're kind of behind or whatever, I would recommend catching up on those. And with that, we can call it good, and we'll be back in person on Thursday. So if nobody else has anything, see you all later, and see you on Thursday, where we'll be talking about spatial analysis.
Bye, thank you.